Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah, it has been such a wonderful morning. I have heard beautiful sharings and lessons from our previous lectures as well. I hope everyone is doing well. Maybe just a quick checkup on how everybody's doing in the chat. How is everyone doing? If you need a quick stretch, please do so. Maybe some of us have been sitting for a long time. It's good to stretch a little bit. Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So today I'm interested to share a little bit on demonstrating meaningful family life. I'm Fatimah Al-Attas from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman Kuliah of Islamic Revealed Knowledge and Human Sciences at the International Islamic University of Malaysia. So today's sharing is actually coming from a specific field from sociology, in which we call sociology of marriage and family. So what we will try to do together today is to first explore some of the evolving definitions and structures of family in the contemporary context. I noticed in Dr. Mala's session just now, there were some questions about choices of being childless or not having children. As we know, we are experiencing some big changes in our time. So in terms of social issues and ways of living. So we will explore a little bit on that. And then we will also look at how personal choices, social context, and diverse experience shape family dynamics. So as this is already, there has already been several sessions that have taken a sociological outlook. I hope some of us have also get used to what it means to observe something from a sociological perspective. So we will look at how personal choices are affected by sociological or social surrounding, and also how our choices affect the social world. And then we will examine concepts of family life, looking at some of the diverse family structures, meaning that how do we see other families, what types of families are there out there, only briefly, and then we reference some Islamic frameworks. So the final part of today's sharing is actually just a very brief look into this idea of the meaningful family and what it looks like and what it could potentially look like for the contemporary context when we reflect on the Quran and the prophetic Sunnah, inshallah. So I hope that we get to do some things together today. I always feel like 45 minutes is such a short time to properly demonstrate and to be doing justice to the topic, but we will try our best to look at some of the issues and see what we can do together, inshallah. So I'm so sorry for this error or issue with the technical issue of the typo. The font. Okay, so the sociology of marriage and family is a field within the study of sociology. And what we do in this field of sociology of marriage and family, essentially we are examining the different structures in the family. So a family can be seen as a structure, and also the dynamics of family structures and people in the family and how they respond to or they affect others outside of the family. And then we also look at functions of marriage and family as social institutions. So in this area of field, we also explore how marriage and family is shaped by other social institutions, for example, the economy and how it affects our lives in the family, or other types of economy, other types of governance, just like Dr. Mala's class, the media, for example, relating back also to Dr. Shakira's class, and how all these other social institutions, including religion, including education, affecting the family, and then how do individual behaviors and cultures and norms within the family then impact the individuals themselves and also the norms in our society. So it is basically acknowledging that the family doesn't exist on its own. It is always existing dynamically in the society. Our society and other social institutions affect the family, and the family affects the other institutions as well by affecting individuals and affecting social norms. For example, how does our economic condition, the political situation affecting our decisions to have children, or how we raise our children, or the type of parenting that we can have with our children. And then at the same time, those actions that we take at the familial level, how that affects each other in our family, and those individuals become part of the society. So it's never separated, it always comes together. So from the sociological perspective of studying marriage and family, it's not just thinking about what's good for people to do. It's not a prescriptive study per se. It is also very empirical. There's a lot of observations and trying to understand how the larger social world is affecting the family, and then how the family then have an impact on the social world as well. So it's acknowledging that relationship between them. So maybe the first thing we want to do is actually to define families. How do we define what a family is? Because in terms of marriage, we can understand that marriage is typically defined by a social legal term, that we acknowledge that marriage happens through a legal process. And so the definitions of marriages is intertwined with state definitions. So for example, in Malaysia, what does marriage mean? So there must be some legal processes around that. But in terms of family, defining family can be a little bit challenging. There are several reasons why it may be challenging. For example, the first one is that family experiences are varied, meaning that even though we come from the same family, our experiences of our own family might not be the same. So a mother in the same family as the father might not have the same experience of that family. Even if you think about yourself and your siblings, you come from the same family, but how you experience your family might be different. So family experiences are varied, either within the family or among different types of family. So if you look at families in Malaysia, families in Philippines, families in Nigeria, families in Sweden, we don't always have the same experiences. The second is the term family forms. What do families look like? In some contexts, we see we have a single mother here, for example, or a single father. We have families that are made of two parents and one child. We have families, for example, that live in what we call an extended family household, where there are grandparents living together in the same household. There are also forms where there is even bigger than this type of extended family, where we may be living with uncles and cousins and aunties in the same household. So the forms of families are also varied too. And in terms of the different societies that we come from, we also see different acceptance and practices of family life. So here we see the third point is that family is a dynamic social phenomenon and it is socially constructed. So what do we mean when we say socially constructed? Basically, we are trying to say that the family forms and shape and experiences are often shaped by social processes and interactions. So we say that this process, of social construction is ongoing. It is always happening. So as individuals interact with one another, we negotiate meanings and definitions that shape our perception of reality. Though although this may not be something that we think of actively, or nor do we do actively, it sort of happens as human beings engage with each other and engage with the world. Say, for example, when we have high rates of divorce and remarriages, then we will see more families that are what we call families that are combined or blended, having children from previous marriages and then new children from new marriages. So it changes. And when, for example, in some countries, there are legalizations of same-sex marriages and acknowledging those as legal, then in those societies, we may see that that could happen as well. Although it may not be in line with our religious beliefs and practices, but this exists. So from the sociological standpoint, we must observe and analyze and understand how this sort of reacts or responds to the world and how it will affect the world around us and how people understand and perceive family. So basically, that is some of the challenges that we have in coming up with a sort of a concrete idea of or a definition of a family. So I will share just two examples of definitions of family in the sociological study. Of course, in sociology of marriage and family, there are many perspectives. So we don't just hold on to one perspective in sociology. Different perspectives exist, and so there is a different view of the social world. Of course, every perspective that we consider as a sociological perspective goes through the empirical process. So this is one example of a perspective that defines family. So this perspective is called the functionalist perspective. So structural functionalism is one of the theoretical frameworks or perspective in sociology. I think some of my colleagues have defined the structural functionalist perspective in the previous weeks. So essentially, the structural functionalist perspective sees the world as having different parts that are interdependent and performing different functions, but together as a system. Just like, for example, if we think of a body, so a body has different organs. There is the heart, we have our eyes, we have our hands, we have our lungs. There are different organs that do different things, but they are all interconnected to one another and interdependent. So the failure of one part may affect another part. So the family could be the heart of the body, for example, or the lungs of the body. So even from the familial perspective, even just looking at the family, we may find that the functionalist tends to break down the family into its roles and its functions and the structure of it. So here we see the definition of the family from the functionalist perspective as a social group characterized by common residence. And then there is economic cooperation and reproduction. So this includes adults of both sexes, at least two of whom maintain socially approved sexual relationship, and one or more children, either they are own children adopted of these two adults. So this definition was from 1949. In more recent definitions given by Western perspective, they may also include, or they may exclude actually, adults of both sexes, because in some countries there is legalization of same-sex marriages. So in that way, the definitions change. This is an example of the family being dynamic and the acknowledgement of that family institution being dynamic. But also another point that we can see changes from 1949 to today is the idea of common residences. In today's context, often we find that families don't always stay in the same house. So we have this concept of the satellite families. And you can also reflect on your own families and how you practice family. Sometimes between the husband and wife, one is working in a different state or even in a different country, but you still acknowledge that you are within the same family or the same household, even though physically you are not staying in the same locality. So we see these shifts and changes in definitions as well. The second definition I'm going to share is from one Islamic perspective, looking at the structure and family, the structure of the family, but also acknowledging that from the Islamic perspective, the family doesn't just exist within the physical realm. It is not a secular kind of perspective. There is other contexts that are associated with it, and we understand this as a Tawhidic epistemology or principle of understanding how everything works within the Tawhidic epistemology. So the family, according to Hamuda Abdul Ati, is a special kind of structure whose principles are related. Principles here being the people in the family are related to one another through either blood ties or marital relationships. And this relatedness that we have with each other in the family entails a mutual expectation. That means I have a right over you and you have a right over me. I have an obligation and a responsibility towards you, and you have a responsibility towards me. So we can think of it as, for example, in marital relationships, the husband and wife are connected to one another and related to one another and have rights and obligations or responsibilities, the child and the parent and so on. And these relatedness and also the expectations and rights here are prescribed by religion. And it is also reinforced by law. And it is also internalized by the individual. So we see three different levels here from the Islamic perspective. One is the divine level, and then we also acknowledge that the marriage and the family does not exist in a vacuum in the dunya realm. It also is taken care of or reinforced or supported by the legal system. And then there is also the element of the soul and the element of the individual as understanding and acknowledging and also internalizing responsibilities, rights of the person within the relatedness to one another. So this is, I believe, a much more reflective definition of the family from the Islamic perspective. So when we think about families, I want to introduce two concepts. Okay, the first is what we call the family of orientation. So this family is basically the family that we were born into. So maybe some of us, we do not yet have what we call the family of procreation. So the family of procreation is the family that we create through marriage and then having children. So we can see, for example, this girl, she's born into this family. So this is her family of orientation, and as she grows older, she may marry and have children of her own, and this becomes her family of procreation. So many of us might already experience both family of orientation and family of procreation. Okay. All right, so let's do some things together. I have some questions for you. Maybe some things that you can think about and you can answer. If you can answer, you can write it in the chat so we can have some engagement. Or you can just think about it and that helps you think about the next parts of today's class. So how is your family of orientation, the family you were born and raised in, different from your family of procreation, if you already have a family of procreation? But if you don't yet have a family of procreation, perhaps what you feel your family of procreation will be like. So what was your family of orientation like? So maybe you can think about how many members that you have in your family of orientation, and then if you already have a family of procreation, how many family members do you have now? You can also think about where you live, how your life is like, the time you spend with each other, and also the kinds of relationship that you have. And then as you think about it, I also want you to think about why is it that, for example, I can give an example. My parents had more children than I have now. Why is that so? Why do we have less children? Or we used to spend a lot of time together. We have less time together now. Or we used to not have something, but now that I have a family, I learned that I want to spend more time with my children. So why is that happens? Okay, I have an answer. Mine is smaller than the one I come from. Okay, so that's one. Any other responses? How many children did your parents have? And how many children did you have? Or do you have? Or maybe you can also think about when did your parents get married, and when did you get married? Or when do you think you will get married? Is that the same or different? "13 siblings, okay, but now 5. From my grandfather, my uncles are 18 on the father's side and 36 on the mother's side, mashallah." So much bigger family sizes and smaller family sizes today. So we know that the family experiences change, and these changes are not really unique to one person, right? It's not unique to one family. So this gives us this sociological perspective. So Farida here shares of different family forms of her mother passing away and then having a stepmother, and so there are different lines of family. So very interesting. So we already see that there are different forms and structures of family. Thank you so much for sharing. So in the Quran, oh ya Allah, I'm so sorry about these format changes that happened as I was downloading the document. I will correct it before I hand it over um, to the organizers. So in the Quran, Allah says, "O humanity, indeed we have created you a male and female from Dhakari wal Untha and made you into peoples and tribes so that you may get to know one another. Surely the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous of you. Allah is truly all-knowing and all-aware." So we can see that in the world that we live in today, or in reflecting in the historical context, the world changes. And not only that the world changes, we come from different parts of the world and we have different cultures and different ways of practicing family and existing as a family. So perhaps in the rural areas, we generally find that people have more children. And as the urban life grows, we notice that family sizes tend to decrease. And if we look at cultural practices around marriage and family, we also see differences in how people experience marriage and family life. So I want to share some of the current patterns and changing patterns of marriage and family. And this is a lot of the things that we do in sociology sometimes, is looking at a lot of graphs and statistics and then trying to interpret that and what that means for us. And that interpretation and analysis really reflects our perspective and where we are coming from. So we know that from 1920 up until 2018, about 100 years of reflection, looking back 1 century, we find that marriage trends have been quite dynamic. It has decreased and increased, and we know that this have had to do with the world wars and times after the world war and so on. But generally, we find that today, starting from the 90s, marriage patterns have declined generally. And we also know that on average, women marry much later. So you can think about when your grandmothers got married, or when you got married, or when you got married to your wife, for example. So we know that women are getting married a little bit older, but in some countries it remains relatively similar. But generally, in the global context, we see an increase in the average of women at marriage. This means that when did a woman first got married? So we see from an average of 20, it has increased much higher. And in the context of Malaysia, it is also the same. We also find that after the 2000s, so after the last 20 years or so, we find that there are legalizations of same-sex marriages around the world. So this is an example, this is a portrayal of which countries same-sex marriages are legal, partially legal, banned or partially banned, okay, or they are banned in some areas but not in other areas. So this is an example of some of the changing patterns. We also find that interestingly, that in the past, marriage, like we see in the definition earlier from 1949, marriage is typically paired with parenthood. That means that there is an expectation that when people get married, they will have children, or that children are typically born out of marriages, that people have children within marriages and not outside of marriage. But in the current context, we see more practices and more occurrences of children not being associated with marriage. So we call it the decoupling of parenthood and marriage, that people tend to have children outside of marriage. So this can happen either through the traditional natural way of cohabitation, sex outside of marriage, and so on. And also it may be related to assisted reproductive technology. So the advancement of technology that allows people to have children even without physical contact with the other person. So these changes are happening in our world, and we can see that the numbers are on the rise. So there are things for us to reflect on and think about. On the other hand, at the global context, we also find that there is a decrease a decline in fertility rates, meaning the number of children that are born to women in their fertility age. Okay. So we find that in order to replace the previous population, okay, the fertility rate should be at 2.3. So you see here, the replacement fertility rate, this means that the rate for us to replace the previous generation would be 2.3, okay. But in many countries, the fertility rate has declined. So despite changes in policy and introductions of incentives, it has been quite challenging for those countries to increase their fertility rates. So we know that this trending decline is happening. So in the past, we find that in 1950, typically fertility rate was at 5. Okay, but in 2021, it went down to 2.2, below the replacement rate. So at this stage, okay, we can say that by 2100, 97% of all countries in the world will have fertility rates below the replacement rate. That means we can no longer sustain the population size. So that means that at that point, the world population size will decrease. And of course, we will notice there will be smaller family sizes. This is quite interesting because in the early 60s and 70s, a lot of social scientists were worried about the increase in the fertility rates. There were concerns that the world will be overpopulated. But we find that the world is quite dynamic in this way, that it changed. There were shifts. And these shifts were brought about by social, economical, and political factors relating to some policies. It also relates to our economic life. It also relates to how people perceive their life and meaning and purpose of their life. Let's look at marriages and divorce now. So we also want to observe divorce rates. We find that although there were concerns about rising divorce rates in the 80s, 70s, in fact, in the 90s, there were concerns about increasing divorce rates. We find that after the 2000s, divorce rates actually have been stabilizing or declining. So this tells us that things change and they are dynamic. And we also see here on the right top graph is the duration of marriages. That means how long the marriage lasted before there was divorce. Okay, but not all marriages, of course, end in divorce. In the marriages that end in divorce, how long? And what is actually interesting about these findings is also to see when the marriage started. So there are studies that look into this. So we find that in the recent years, basically, at 2019, marriages that end in divorce are marriages that are older, meaning for 14 years. But of course, when we look at these countries, we may find that the countries that we live in may have different duration of marriages. For example, in Malaysia, 5 to 10 years have higher divorce rates than other age groups. But we do see an increase in marriages that decline or marriages that end in divorce that are between 15 to 20 years. This would be very interesting questions for sociologists working in the field to understand what do these patterns tell us about people's behaviors, and also how these decisions affect the world and are affected by perhaps certain markers during that time. And then, of course, when there are divorces among people who are married and have children, we also see changing patterns among single parents. So as there are divorces, there will be single parent families. So single parent families have been increasing generally in most countries, although not in all countries. So these are also telling us what are happening to children and how they experience life. Okay, so as we are moving along, the second part of my sharing today is actually some reflections on the Quran and the prophetic tradition, but using a sociological perspective. And because the session is very brief, I don't have a lot of time to share a lot. So I've taken some parts that I think are very interesting and I think may also be helpful for us to think about, really in terms of understanding how fields of knowledge that we have can really help us rethink some of the stereotypes or some of the thinking that we have that may not be helpful for us as we try to help our ummah. So in reflecting on this, I also want to bring in some sociological input, and then we can see where the integration of these two knowledges happen together. So maybe some more questions for everyone. So what do we think about parenthood today, or this concept of childlessness, choosing not to have children or not having children, whether it is by choice or not? So childlessness and child-free patterns today. So what do you think about it? What do you think about experiences of being a parent today, if you are, or if you're not a parent, you can also respond. Are there a lot of parents also in the session? Okay, I have a response from Aisha that it is one's choice whether to have children or otherwise. It is very interesting to see also the changes that happens in our world today as we move to more postmodern types of thinking, and how people consider what choices are available and what can they do. If we think about the past, often even in terms of, say, for example, occupation or age of marriage, we or the people of the past rarely had a lot of opportunities to choose, as the world was not given, or they were not given as many choices as today. But also the challenges may be different. Okay, Aisha is saying that there are financial factors or economical factors, acknowledging that the economy of the world and people's lifestyle and the demands of the world affects people's choices and also people's behaviors. We have a response here. Modern parents have abandoned their roles for the social media parenthood. Okay, so there's a relationship between parenting, parenthood, and social media. Also responses about availability of childcare and parenting. This recognizes that parenting today involves a certain type of work, right? In traditional societies, work may look different. In the capitalistic world that we live in, we understand work as something different, and this shapes our availability of time and how we are able to gain economic income for our families and so on. Okay, there is a response. Having children is a gift from Allah, which one should not make a choice but have a hope. Okay, it's important to have children and grandchildren. Okay. Parenthood increases the need for adults to reflect on the effort required in present time to bring up children in a challenging condition. There are also some considerations as to the world that we live in, and perhaps other challenges, and some would consider fitna of our time, and how parents are supposed to respond to them. So I think in thinking about some of these changes and some of these challenges, I have prepared some of the examples that is moving forward. Okay, there is also one response from a brother here. Less children today is also due to financial reasons, but also related to the focus of females. Their success is dictated by their personal development in society. Okay. All right, so we're going to have some interesting discussions today. So I want to start off first with some reflections on parenthood, whether child-free or childlessness. So from the examples that we see from the Quran and Sunnah, of course, we understand that there are different diversity in terms of people having children and not having children. So we know that there are examples that marriage does not result in having children. But of course, in this context, we see the example of Zakaria here, alayhi salam, in which he was already an old man and he is asking Allah for children, and acknowledging that having children is not really our choice in one context, meaning that it is something that we ask Allah for, and we do not have the certainty that just because we are married and we are trying that we will have children. So there is an example here of Prophet Zakaria, but also in acknowledging sometimes some of the sociological research shows that there is a lot more emphasis on infertility in the case of childlessness, on stigma, and also how it is different in terms of the different genders. For women, for example, not having children, often women experience more stigma than men. So women who cannot have children, for example, due to health issues, often experience more social stigma than men. And these social stigma has an impact on their experiences of mental health and also feelings of inadequacy and guilt. And more than men, women often feel more societal pressures of not having children. But this is the beauty, I think, always for us as Muslims to reflect on the Quran. And in the Quran, we find that it was the case of Zakaria that was brought forward. And in Allah's wisdom, we see that, right? In our context, sometimes we tend to look at women as the main person to think about when we think about children and having children. But here, we find that it was Zakaria that was the one that asked Allah. And this was what was included in the Quran. And I wanted to highlight that. Number one is there is no certainty of people to have children just by being married. So marriage and parenthood may not be something that comes together. We also see in the context of Aisha, the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, she also did not have children. And there wasn't stigma. And in the example of the Prophet ﷺ, she was never shamed for not having children, for example. So let's move on because there are some other examples also that I would like to share. And reflecting on the roles of fathers. So what would be the role of a father and how can we describe what a good father is? So what makes a good father? What are some characteristics of a good father, do you think? Or what should a father in a family do? What is his responsibility? Provisions of food and shelter, accommodation, and leading the way. Thank you for the response. A good father has to be a good provider and a leader. Concerned and responsible. Taking care and meeting family needs. A good leader, an empathic leader. Okay. Provider for the family and loving and caring. It is always interesting actually for us to think about how we are responding and where our responses are coming from. Are we thinking about how our cultures and upbringing also affecting what we think a father is? And are we responding from our experience of what we've seen and what we hope for? So that's also interesting to look at. Okay, there is more answers here. Thank you so much for all the responses. Lead the family towards akhir and make sure they are good examples. Support the mother in her educational efforts for the children. One who provides care for his children is a good role model. A father should be role model for the family. All right, okay. So many responses. I'm not going to read all of them, but there are so many good responses here. Thank you, everybody. So I want to talk about how we can see mothers and fathers or individuals in the family with specific roles affected by the social surrounding and culture, and how some things that we feel or that the culture or the people, the society, the public feel are affected by these ideas that are sometimes portrayed or understood. And how we as Muslims can reflect on the Quran and Sunnah as a form of guidance for us Thank you for the responses. Some fathers here for 24 years, mashallah. Okay. So generally, in the study of sociology of marriage and family, in the first part of the study, or when we say from the Western context, in the earlier decades of studying marriage and family, the focus was always on mothers and the role of mothers. There were a lot more materials and research done on experiences of mothers, the importance of children's attachments to mothers, and how important mothers are in children's lives. And while those are really important, and we also see this within the Muslim community, and I don't say this the Islamic context, I say the Muslim community. We also see the emphasis of mothers and mothering within the Muslim community. But often we don't see a lot of the context or discussions on fatherhood and fathering, especially if we look at before the 1990s or 1980s. And in the Muslim society, sometimes we also still see a very skewed idea of what fathers and what fatherhood and fathering is. But from the Western context, there has been a lot more discussions actually and research that are done on fatherhood, because we noticed that in the 1990s and 2000s, the lack of fathers' relationship and also their support and their active participation in family had a very detrimental impact on children and the family units in the Western context. So we find that after the 1980s and 1990s, there are more research done on the role of fathers. And also we see at the global context, there have been shifting ideas of masculinity. When we say masculinity here, we're not referring to the sex, we're referring to gender. So gender is very much affected by the cultural context. Say, for example, we can say what is masculine in one context may not be masculine in another context. I can give a simple example. Say, for example, in most Malay society, men do not touch other men, and that is considered something that is masculine. But for our brothers in Africa or the African continent generally, or even in other parts of South Asia, men holding hands with men does not dictate their masculinity. It is a very normal occurrence. But in the Malay region, for example, men do not walk holding hands with other men. So masculinity is very cultural. It is not just about how we are born, or for example, being fathers, but also thinking about some of the cultural context as well. So as masculinity shifts, we see, for example, in the West, there are more rigid ideas of masculinities and femininities also. Say, for example, in today's context, colors are ascribed to certain genders, that blue is only for boys and pink is only for girls, but color is a color, for example. So we find that there are changing ideas about masculinity, especially in the 1980s and 1990s in the West. There's a very, what they call the toxic idea of masculinity. So in the Western context, we saw that in the 19th century, with the rise of capitalism, Western fathers tend to focus on success, life outside of the family. So we see that this idea that a good father is a good provider, that there is a separation of the two realms, the realm of the home and the realm of the outside world, that fathers are responsible for the outside world and mothers are responsible for the home world. And these ideas and social norms and normative contexts also sometimes affect Muslims who are living in the West, but also Muslims who are living in other parts of the world due to globalization. So we may think that it is normal for fathers to be more involved outside, and the home life is only for mothers, and child rearing is only for mothers, and fathers do not involve themselves in child rearing, for example. But we know that, for example, in the case of the examples in Quran, and very beautifully, there are so many examples from the Quran of fathers and their fatherhood and fathering. So one of the examples here is the example of Ibrahim when he was asked to sacrifice Ismail, and we all know this story. I like to highlight the part that he goes to Ismail and he says, "Oh, my dear son, I have seen in a dream that I must sacrifice you. So tell me what you think." In this context, it's very beautiful because from the sociological perspective, we can see that the relationship of Ibrahim and Ismail, number one, is of a consulting nature, that he has a relationship with Ismail and a dear relationship of Ismail. So he is not separated from his children. Number two is also that he consults the child to ask what the child thinks. And this is not the same in the traditional context of fatherhood where the father makes the decision and the child only listens. So this is not the authoritarian type of parenting. So we see here that he consults the child and he asks the child what the child thinks. And the child responds, reflecting the fathering that he has done. The child responds in a way that shows that the child has been parented well. "Oh, my dear father, do as you are commanded." So also acknowledging that the role of belief system is already embedded within the child, which is Prophet Ismail alayhi salam. And then, of course, we also want to look at the importance of the emotional responsibility and the role of fathers in the emotional upbringing of children. So culturally, or in the context of the traditional family where fathers take on the role outside of the family, fatherhood, usually we do not see fathers as having the emotional intelligence and also the emotional role to be there for their children. But recent research shows the importance of fathers being engaged not only in the outside world of breadwinning and providing, but the role of the fathers in the educational experience, the cognitive experience of children, and also their emotional regulation. So we see here that children who are engaged in educational activities with their fathers demonstrate better cognitive skills. And when fathers play with their children, then the children have better or enhanced academic performance and also behavioral regulation. So the role of fathers are important, and we see this also reflected in the Quran. For example, we know the story of Prophet Yusuf and Prophet Yaqub, and I think in this context, there are many lessons for us to learn actually about families and familial dynamics and challenges in family. For example, in the story of Prophet Yaqub alayhi Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, we know that Yaqub had many children and not all of his children became prophets, and Yusuf alayhi salam was one that became a prophet, and the way that he treated the children was of a particular nature. And I wanted to highlight this verse because I wanted to highlight that here we find that Prophet Yusuf actually told his father about a dream. And this is something that tells us about a relationship that a father and child has built, a bond that tells that the child trusts the father. And there is always an emotional connection for the child to go back to the father. It's something for fathers to reflect on as well, in thinking about the very everyday and day-to-day life kind of experiences that children and fathers have with each other. Here's another example of studies that we find in terms of why is it important for fathers to be there for their children's emotion and to teach them what to do with their emotion and how to be empathetic and empathic, for example, and also how do we acknowledge our emotions. In a very toxic kind of environment or toxic masculinity, men generally feel that they cannot relate to their emotion because emotions is the realm of the female, or men do not cry, for example. So sometimes when fathers show these types of standards to their children, especially their sons, these are what we call socialization process. Children tend to learn from what they see around them. So when fathers are able to coach their children emotionally in a positive way, then the children's ability to cope with their own emotion is also improved. And we see this, of course, in the case of the Prophet ﷺ, which is a very beautiful. And I also see some other context here that I feel I want to highlight. So Aisha radiallahu anha once said that she did not see, or I did not see anyone who resembled the Prophet ﷺ more than Fatimah. So when she came to see him, or when she came to him, he would stand up. He would stand up and he would welcome her, and he would kiss her and let her sit in his place. And this is so beautiful in thinking about the context of the world that they lived in, the cultural context that the Prophet ﷺ lived in, which used to be a very patriarchal society, and women, especially daughters, didn't have a very high rank. But the Prophet showed a very good example in this way, that he acknowledged the arrival of the child, and this makes the child, of course, feel very special. But the beauty of that is also that this child was a girl, and Fatima was a girl, and he showed that he was caring and that he was affectionate, not just in the privacy of their home, but also that the father shows their love also in the outside context, and that they celebrate them. And this is something I think for all of us to think about in terms of how we live our life. And in return, then we see that when the Prophet ﷺ came to see Fatima, she would also stand up and take his hand and make them. And this shows how children learn from their parents, and there is a high chance that when children learn from their parents, they will also repeat that when they are grown up. And then I also want to talk about some emotions, and how typically in today's context, when we talk about fatherhood and fathering, the emphasis rarely talks about how fathers are really influential in terms of showing how to deal with emotions. And in the example of the Prophet ﷺ, and also in the example shown in the Quran of Prophet Yaqub, we see that these fathers show experiences of grief, and they show it in an open way, and they show also examples on how to deal with it. For example, the Prophet ﷺ, the loss of his son Ibrahim, he was asked by a companion, and he said, "Oh no, not you too, Prophet, you are crying." And he said that, and this is a very famous narration also, "Verily the eyes shed tears and the heart grieves, and we are saddened over your departure, O Ibrahim," because he was holding Ibrahim. But he also ends it with, "But we will not say except that which is pleasing to our Lord." So there is grief, there is sadness, and show of clear grieving and crying also of the father, but also acknowledging that at the end, inna lillahi wa inna ilaihi raji'un. So whatever that Allah has decreed was what is one. So there is a continuation of the idea that the relationship between the father and child is real and very strong, but all of us exist within the Tawhidic world, meaning that at the end of the day, this is Allah's decree, and Allah has decided for us. Similarly, we see this in the context of Yaqub alayhi salam, and how he responds to his sons who have done this to Yusuf. He turned away from his sons, and these are also his children. So here is another lesson in acknowledging that sometimes the father and the child's outcomes are not always the same. And we see other examples of this also in our traditions, examples of other prophets, where even though the fathers were prophets chosen by Allah, the children were not following the religion of Allah. So he turned away from the other children, and he says, "How sad I am about Yusuf." And he cried until his eyes turned white with sorrow, and he was very sad, and he continued crying for a long time. So these are examples and portrayals that I think are very strong, that we often don't reflect on when we think about fatherhood and fathering. And I feel like there is a wealth of lessons for us to think about and to lean on as we are dealing with the changing dynamics of the world, with political global challenges, with economic challenges, and thinking about how do we live our world. There's a lot more for us to reflect on from the prophetic tradition and the Quran, for example, to guide us and also to help us think, because indeed the Quran is sent down to us for us to think, and the prophetic example, the Prophet ﷺ and his life, is also there for us to think and for us to reflect on. Sometimes we are caught up by cultures and norms that we don't remember to, or we don't critically analyze them in thinking about a very rigid idea or a rigid way of doing things. So often we have to always remind ourselves as Muslim thinkers and also students of knowledge that there is more for us to do, and there is more for us to reflect on, and there is also a sense of hope for us, and that the family unit and the family system is our responsibility. But indeed, at the end of the day, we make dua to Allah that He provides us the best, whether it is in terms of having children, in terms of navigating day-to-day life, in terms of the outcome for us and our family. So as a conclusion to my sharing today, I'm just sharing a dua made by Prophet Ibrahim on asking Allah that we have children and continuity and descendants that submit to Allah, inshallah. So I think I will open the session to questions and answers. I think there is a little bit more time, or there's no more time.
Doctor, we have passed the time for 10 minutes already.
Okay. Alright. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay.
So, and also they have a lot of question there during your lecture, right, Doctor?